Hey everybody, this is your Right Geek, honorary man king and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, here with a recorded video. Today I'm going to discuss some things that I discovered looking at Iron Man sales through the ages. This video was obviously inspired by some of the work that Comics Perch has been doing over on his channel, looking at the sales, for example, of Captain Marvel comics. He also did work tracking what happened with Kamala Khan's sales, and as some very interesting information that he's discovered. Those videos have been very enlightening, and they kind of inspired me to look at what has been going on in terms of sales of the mainline Iron Man comic. So today I'm going to talk about what I discovered looking at the Comic-Con data for Iron Man sales through the ages. And I hope that you find this as interesting and as illuminating as I found it. All right, so the Right Geek discusses Iron Man sales through the ages. Just some quick notes on methods. Again, I use the Comic-Con data, so that data tells us about sales to shops or other distribution points, and not necessarily sales to readers. So that's something to keep in mind. But it does give us an idea of how many copies per issue were circulating for these comics, even if it doesn't really give us a lot of information as to how many readers were picking these comics up. Um, I focused again on the main Iron Man book in each period. I didn't look at data on miniseries, alternate universes, or one shots because the main book, that was a lot of data just by itself. So I didn't look at some of the short-lived series like, say, Iron Man Noir or Iron Man Rapture, or some of the side stories that have been done in modern times that only lasted for a few issues. I only looked at the main Iron Man or Invincible Iron Man title. Uh, I actually decided to start with the 80s and 90s, even though obviously in that time frame we were dealing with a different kind of market. Back then, if I'm not mistaken, comics were not just sold in comic book stores. They were also sold in um, convenience stores and supermarkets and 7-Elevens. So it was a different kind of market, a different time. There was a lot less competition for entertainment dollars. So, so obviously, it's not necessarily a fair comparison to say, oh, well, it sold this much in the 80s, and now it's not selling as much, so something's wrong. It's not necessarily a fair comparison. However, I wanted to look at this because I was kind of interested in how the Iron Man book did during this time period. And one thing I noticed that is, in fact, worthy of comment, even if we consider the caveats that it was a different market and a different time, is how stable the Iron Man sales were throughout the 80s. If you look at the blue line here in the graph, you see that there's little dips and valleys, but it stayed roughly around just under 200,000 copies per issue on average were in circulation. 200,000. And I also have the red line up here showing the Spider-Man sales during the same time frame, just to give you some sense of perspective, since Spider-Man was kind of the A-list title for Marvel during this period and is still pretty much an A-list character. Whereas Iron Man is more of a mid-seller, but you can see that during the 80s there was a lot of stability. So that's interesting because during the 80s, there were many creative teams during this period. But each time the team changed, there wasn't a whole lot of change in how the book was selling. And it was selling solidly compared to, say, Spider-Man or other books in the Marvel line. Um, Sales around 200,000, if that had happened today, Iron Man would be at number one. So that's really quite interesting. And then we get to the 90s, and of course, as we know, there was a lot of instability in the 90s. I put a little arrow here to indicate when the comic book crash happened, and you can see that prior to the crash, there was a lot of a speculation going on with the Amazing Spider-Man titles. We see this huge peak here with the Spider-Man line, but there was also a little peak with Iron Man too. But then the crash happened, and he just continued to drop off. Now, as someone who has read the Iron Man title, I know that there were many, many bad decisions that were made with the Iron Man title in the '90s, including, oh, well, let's make Tony Stark evil and then kill him off and then replace him with the teen Tony Stark, which that that storyline I'm gonna do a separate video on, because that was terribly bad, as I said over the live stream that we last did. Um, and you know, there were some other bad decisions that were made during the '90s for the Iron Man title, so I can see, like, I can definitely understand why interest in that title steadily dropped off during the '90s. After the crash, however, when the comic book market started to go into its somewhat recovery phase, we can see at the end here that that Iron Man almost got back up to his pre-crash levels, his 1980s levels. He was almost at that 200,000 books sold line. And that's interesting too, because when we start looking at the Hero's Return, so when we start looking at Volume 3, we're almost at the pre-crash levels for Iron Man here at the beginning of this run, um, or at the beginning of this volume. But then we see by 1999 we're dropping off again. Um, and basically what's happening here is we're seeing the new pattern set in. The modern pattern that I noticed as I was looking at this data actually starts setting in here at the end of the 1990s. And you'll notice here that I continue to put the Spider-Man line here just again for perspective. The Spider-Man line stayed steady. He didn't really recover the sales that he was getting in the '80s. But again, during the '80s, we had a different market. Now we are very much in the direct market era. So now the comics are being sold in the comic shops. Pretty much, that's where you're going to get them. So, and again, as we get into the 2000s, we start to see more competition for entertainment dollars again. So everyone is selling a little bit less than they did in the 1980s. But there's a difference here, because Spider-Man sales stay relatively constant, whereas the Iron Man sales just slowly drop off. You know, we could argue again, as I said here, there was a recession in the early 2000s, which could explain some of the drop off for Iron Man. But if it was solely about the recession, then we would see a similar pattern for some of the other comics that were also available in the line, like Spider-Man, and we don't see that same pattern. Now, that could be explained by the fact that Spider-Man fans are just extremely loyal and will buy Spider-Man comics no matter what's going on with them economically. Um, but I think also that during this period, this early period, there may have been some mistakes made in the Iron Man comic that inspired the loss of interest in the Iron Man book. Now, that's an interesting discovery, because a lot of people would say that it was Civil War that broke Iron Man, or that it was some of the later runs like Bendis or uh, Gillen, or some of the later runs that broke Tony Stark and made it impossible to sell his book. But actually, the sales slump starts much earlier than that. It starts prior to Civil War. It starts in the late. It starts as early as 1999. We see this drop off in sales from his pre-crash levels. So yeah, there may have been mistakes made here, that resulted in a loss of interest from the readers. From after the crash, it looked like readers were interested and were willing to see where this character was going to go, but apparently, what happened during this volume 3 did not satisfy. Uh, Even though I kind of like a lot of the things that happened in volume 3, but apparently the market did not agree. Um, then we come to the Civil War era, and another surprise. Surprisingly, Extremis, which is the first 6 issues here that are covered in this graph, didn't really move Iron Man books all that much. The first issue was almost 70,000, but then after that, it dropped off. Now, that was a bit of a surprise to me because what I've heard from most of the commentators that I listen to on YouTube is that Extremis is uh, considered to be one of the best Iron Man storylines, at least among YouTube commentators, and it's at least one of the most respected, but it didn't actually result in much of the way of sales. Um, so that's a bit of a surprise. So I thought I would point that out. Also, however, the Civil War event did drive sales. Iron Man did enjoy the Civil War bump just like everyone else, and that's the second arrow right here, where we see this peak. We see these peaks here. These issues are the Civil War tie-ins, and then also the immediate post Civil War period. Um, uh, uh, in which we address what happens in after the Civil War and Iron Man becoming the director of Shield. That's these issues here, and um, these actually were enjoying some pretty solid sales. Uh, but once that period passed, we drop off back to what appears to be the modern average as I look at all of this data. um, the modern average seems to be a roughly 40,000 issues sold, give or take, depending on the creator, um, which is definitely for a lot of titles you would look at 40,000 and say, "Huh, that's a solid base hit." But if we're talking about Iron Man, I feel like 40,000 is not really um, it's not really what I would call success for the title because um, in the past, of course, he sold a lot more, and we're talking about a character too who has several movies and a lot of public interest, at least that has been inspired by the movies. So, a character who has several movies and a lot of public interest and a lot of public recognition is only selling 40,000 copies on average. That's a problem, and we need to like examine why the sales are so poor. Just a quick note that Matt Fraction's run kind of overlaps at the end of this graph here. They started him in the 30s here for the Civil War era comics. And I wrote here personally, I think there's a lot of good stuff in this period, but evidently the market didn't agree. Um, I liked a lot of these comics that were immediately after the Civil War period here, but they didn't get a lot. They didn't pull a lot of sales, so uh, we have to examine why that might be. Okay. Then we move on to Matt Fraction, and Matt Fraction doesn't really move the needle all that much. Matt Fraction's run displays the typical pattern. There's the high number 1, possibly overshipped. Um, and then there's a quick drop off to the status quo ante. Now, for a while there, he was running at about 50,000, which is actually a little bit better than the modern average. But then, as his run starts to go on, it starts to really drop off well below the modern average. Um, the first arrow here, there's a little peak right here. that is the start of the heroic age. That's after we were coming out of Dark Reign and all of those events. And then the second arrow is the issue 500 bump. But as we can see, we're at 50,000, and then we just kind of slowly slide down to about 30,000 by the end of his run. And this is the typical pattern that I saw um, for all of the runs from Matt Fraction onward, pretty much. Um, Matt Fraction's average circulation was 45,000, excluding the number one, and the decline from issue 2 was about 46%, the downward trend. So Matt Fraction's run doesn't really do anything to sell Iron Man books. And Gillen doesn't really move the needle either. His pattern is very much the same. As you can see, the high number one and then the slow slide downward. So that we actually see that same pattern that appears during Gillen's run. This first little peak right here, this first arrow, was the first issue of The Secret Origin of Tony Stark. That one might have generated some interest because it promised to tell us something new about the character. And I think a lot of, just my theory is people might have wanted to see something new done with the character. But then when they discovered what the new thing was, interest for it immediately dropped off. And that I can definitely understand because nobody asked for retconning Tony Stark's parentage. I think that was kind of a stupid idea, personally. And what it did was basically deconstruct that whole Stark family instead of giving us anything genuinely new. We also have this other little peek here. That was the first issue of the Rings of the Mandarin plot. That probably reflects maybe the market's desire to see more stories involving the Mandarin, which is Tony's most famous adversary. But again, there was a quick drop off when they realized that Rings of the Mandarin wasn't really a very good Mandarin story. And as we see by the end, we're way down in the 30,000 range. So Gillen's average circulation was around 42,000, so he did even worse than Fraction, and his decline was much more abrupt. It was a 62% decline from issue 2 to the last issue. And by the end, we were really scraping the bottom with only 28,000 issues sold, which is very, very pathetic for a character that by this point in time was known to normies thanks to the movies. Then we have the Axis event, and spinning off from that was Tom Taylor's Superior Iron Man, which also did not sell. Again, we have the pattern of the high number one, and then the quick drop off to the base. And the average circulation for Superior Iron Man, which ran for only 9 issues, was around 37,000 copies sold per issue. Apparently, the audience was not that big on supervillain Tony Stark, and I have to say that I agree. That's another video I have to do with talking about how that run. The worst thing about that run is that it assassinates all of the supporting Iron Man characters, and I can go into that in more detail in a Superior Iron Man video some point in the future. But suffice to say that this did not sell either. So I've seen some comments in some YouTube comment sections that, oh, well, they should just lean into it and make Tony a villain. Well, they tried that and it didn't sell. So the audience does not want that either. Brian Michael Bendis outperforms immediate predecessors, but only before he introduces Riri Williams. So here's his graph. Again, we see the high number one and then the quick drop off to base. The number one in this case was the most ridiculous overship for a number one ever, as far as I'm concerned. There's no way that this very, very high number at the beginning was a genuine number for that number one. Um, I think that these are the more genuine numbers here. The first arrow that I'm pointing to on the graph, this little peak right here, was Riri's first issue, which may have also been overshipped. And then we have a peak here for the search for Tony Stark beginning, and then another little peak at the end of his run with issue 600, which was at 59,000. Bendis's average circulation before he introduced Riri, excluding the first issue, was around 53,000. So Brian Michael Bendis actually outperformed his immediate predecessors again, and as far as how many Iron Man books he sold, up until he introduced Riri, and then once Riri Williams became the star of the Iron Man book, the circulation drops off to roughly 39,000 per issue on average. So changing the lead character in the Iron Man book did not lead to better sales. It led to worse sales. Riri Williams was definitely not a hit. But interestingly, Bendis actually was one of the better sellers of Iron Man comics in the beginning when Tony was still the star of his own book. And then finally we get to Dan Slott, which is where the good data on Comic-Con ends. My good data here actually ends with Iron Man 2020 #3. It would be nice to know exactly how many issues were sold for 4 and 5. For 4, 5, and 6, but unfortunately, COVID basically destroyed my ability to get that information. But suffice it to say that Dan Slott's run basically crashes and burns. So after again the first issue peak, Slott never clears the 50,000, so he underperforms compared to his predecessor Bendis. His average circulation is 35,000, so roughly 35,000. So his sales are probably the worst out of anyone, at least in the 21st century. Yeah, so I said here, post 2004, Slott is the worst performer so far. We have no real information on Cantwell's run yet, but Slott's run was terrible for the title. It did not move books, aside from this arrow right here, which is the just the little peak for Iron Man 2020 #1. But otherwise, nobody was interested in Slott's take on Iron Man. So what are some of the conclusions we can draw? It turns out that since Volume 3, almost no one has been able to sell Iron Man comics, though some have done a little better, like Fraction in the beginning part of his run, and Bendis in the beginning part of his run. And some have done a little worse, like, for example, Dan Slott was terrible for the title. Repeated relaunches don't work. Every time you relaunch, you get that #1 bump, but then it drops right back to the previous baseline, and you don't see any change in the sales at all. All the gimmicks that have been tried have been failures. So retconning Tony's parentage, replacing Tony with a new character, making Tony evil because of an inversion wave, all of the kind of frantic things they've done to do something different with the character have not worked at all. The only thing that did work to actually move Iron Man books was incorporating him into the Civil War event, which might bring us to the lesson that if we incorporate Tony more into the overall Marvel universe, if we incorporate the main Iron Man book with other things that are going on in the Marvel universe, you might see more sales from the Iron Man book. And one thing I have noticed in the more recent runs is that those runs seem to be doing whatever the heck they want to, and they really don't have any connection, or they have very little connection to what's going on in, say, the Avengers titles or what's going on elsewhere in the Marvel universe. And as a matter of fact, during Dan Slott's run, there were a couple of books that were not written by Dan Slott. One of them was written by those couple of books that were not written by Dan Slott were tie-ins to the War of the Realms event. And one thing I noticed about those books when I read them is that they were better books. And so I think one thing that we may need to do is we need to get back to what we had in the olden days, where the continuity for the continuity across the line worked as a unit, and people weren't going off and doing their own thing and not tying into what was going on elsewhere. So one thing we may have to do is we may have to solve that disconnect that's going on there. The other thing, so the question we want to ask ourselves is, why can't we sell Iron Man books? So a couple of theories that I have is that, again, they're trying to there's a couple of things that they're trying to do that aren't working because they're not really what the readers want. Um, repeatedly deconstructing the character and doing things like retconning his backstory or making him evil. That's not, or just revisiting the same two major plot lines that happened in Iron Man's past without looking at anything else in Iron Man's past. You know, everyone always goes back to Demon in a Bottle and Armor Wars, and there's nothing else that ever happened in Iron Man's history. That that kind of lack of creativity, I think, is what's driving the reader disinterest, I think. I think what may need to happen in order to move this book forward and get it out of this creative morass that it seems to be stuck in is to find a writer that actually has a deeper knowledge of what has gone on in Iron Man's history up to this point, and that writer needs to actually move Tony forward. So instead of the choices of deconstruction or revisiting of old ideas, respect the history, use the history, and then show that Tony is learning from it and developing as a person. Like I said in the last live stream with Number One Marmaduke Fan, there are a lot of things that have happened in this 21st century period that that could have taught Tony some valuable lessons about the how you can't be overconfident in terms of what one person is able to do in order to safeguard the world. That his Messiah complex maybe needs to be controlled a little bit so that he doesn't overstep his bounds and try to do things that he's really not competent to do. So those kind of lessons from some of these recent events and these recent storylines, well, we should start to see those lessons have an impact on how Tony behaves. We've also discussed in the live stream just moving him forward in his personal life too, allowing him to mature and maybe marry and maybe have a family. Might also do something new with the character, but also respect the past of the character too. There are ways that could be done that could bring in all the things he's learned from everything that has happened to him in past years. What we really need to see, I think, is some sign of learning and growth and change in the character, and it has to be change that is cognizant of the past, that brings in the past and uses the past, and not change just for change's sake, essentially. So anyway, I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on all of the things that I presented here. If you have any ideas as to what we can do to maybe bump Iron Man sales up to something closer to his pre-crash levels, Um, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below for anything you want to say about anything that's been presented here. And I will speak to you again next week.